I'm Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program here at the New America Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to come to today's event. Trade is very much in the news, particularly the U.S. trade deficit with China and the dispute about Chinese currency manipulation, but also questions about the future of U.S. manufacturing. And of course, a very important individual has come to Washington in the middle of these trade disputes, a central player in much of this trade area in recent years. Now, I'm not referring to Hu Jintao. I'm referring to Dr. Ralph Gomery. Dr. Gomery, a mathematician, is a research professor at New York University. Formerly, he was the president of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for 18 years. Prior to that, he was IBM's senior vice president for research and has been awarded many prizes, including the National Medal of Science and 8 honorary degrees. His most recent book, co-authored with Professor William J. Baumol, is Global Trade and Conflicting National Interests, published by MIT in 2001. And this is a must-read. It is one of the great scholarly contributions to the theoretical economic literature on trade, and it's worth reading even if you don't understand all of the mathematics, which I can't follow. And it deals with subjects in a fresh and provocative way, and I hope Dr. Gomery will address some of that today. He's rare among great scholars in that he can take the case to the educated public as well as to his fellow scholars. So you can find very brilliant essays that he publishes periodically in the Huffington Post. So if you're interested in that, this is being broadcast live. Within a few days, we will put it up on our website at the New America Economic Growth Program so that you can access it and see it again. Dr. Ralph Gomery.
I want to thank Michael for that very kind introduction, and I want to thank all of you for braving the conditions and being here. I really appreciate it. Yeah. I also want to thank my longtime partner, Will Baumol, for his contributions over the years, and we're still working together from time to time. So anyway, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. And I'm here to talk about one of the most standard models of international trade, often called the Ricardo model. But I assert that this very familiar model, properly handled, has a number of very unfamiliar consequences. First, the economic development of your trading partner, and they start from a low level and develop, is at first good for you, the home country, but then inevitably it turns bad and has a negative effect. Second, it is possible to establish a dominant and a subservient relation between two countries. This would be a perfectly stable equilibrium. It's good for the dominant one, and it's bad for the subservient one, and we'll describe that. A country can attain such a dominant position only by having an underdeveloped partner. You cannot do it if your trading partner is a fully developed nation. You require something less to get this dominant and very desirable position. And I'm not specifying whether that less is because they were just haven't developed yet or because their industries are being destroyed. In addition, there's inherent conflict not only between such a dominant nation and its trading partner, but also between the dominant nation and what may loosely be called the interests of the world. Now, in a two-country model, the world is quite limited, right? And we will be discussing two-country models. But what this means is if you add up the effects on the two countries as if they were one, right? Having a dominant player is bad. Right? The total is less because of that. You're better off with a pair of countries, neither of which is dominant. Right? And finally, while a country cannot get into a dominant position by building up its own industries, because it requires as an undeveloped partner, it can avoid that subservient position by developing its own industries and not allowing them to be destroyed. Right? You can't build your way into dominance, but you can defend against being dominated. Right? I will explain more clearly what I mean by these things as I go along. And I also explain enough about the Ricardo model so that you can see what its function is, and you don't have to start this talk knowing that. All the conclusions that I've just listed, and we'll see more of them, of course, come from what the Ricardo model has to say about the impact on a developed nation of the economic development of its trading partner. A trading partner that we will mostly assume is starting from a very undeveloped base. And if you want to keep the China-U.S. relationship and the impact of that, of China's growth on the U.S. in mind as a possible example during this talk, you will not go far wrong. Now, this is a very prominent model. It has been taught to generations of students. Of course, much of what is taught today did not originate with Ricardo. He really made certain observations that people have built on. It's still enormously influential. And a good reference, if you want to look it up, is Krugman and Ostfeld's International Economics in the 8th chapter. Now, I'm going to put up, if I press the right buttons, presumably, three PowerPoints that describe the Ricardo model. And I don't expect you at all to take in all the ins and outs of this model, but just get a general impression of what sort of a thing it is. Oh, there it is. Okay. What this model does for you is this. You load certain values. You can see what some of them are here. Productivities, how people want to spend their money, the size of the country's labor forces. Right? The model then, for both countries, then the model then grinds away and it computes the economic outcomes. It grinds away by solving certain equations. And of course, I wanted you to read them all very carefully. But then it comes out with outputs. It tells you which goods are being produced by which countries. It tells you the quantities that were consumed in each country, what the prices are, what the national incomes were, and something which we're going to use, I want to say, I'll say more about later, called utility, which is how good was the bundle of goods that each country received from its own point of view. You know, if they liked onions and hated cabbages, did they get cabbages only? No. So you have to be, it's a fundamental problem. If you're given a string of goods, and you say, oh, is that a good outcome? You have to have some way to evaluate it. Okay? And one of the ways, there are many ways, is utility. Right? Actually, if you know these models and have calculated hundreds of them as I have, you know that the exact measure doesn't matter. Everything I'm going to show you about the qualitative nature of the outcomes holds under any reasonable measure. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the model because I want to spend my time showing you what comes out. The Ricardo model is generally used in a static way. You put one set of inputs in and another set comes out. But you can make it adjust to changing conditions just by putting in a set of inputs and a set of changed inputs and a set of other changed inputs and getting the three outputs. Okay? So you can see what happens as a country evolves. So I'm going to start our discussion by the yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to start our discussion with the famous England, Portugal cloth and wine model. And the country that is going to improve, do we have that? It goes past pretty fast, doesn't it? Yeah. This is what we're going to start with, right? The demand, we're going to put in these numbers into the model and start seeing what comes out. People want to spend more on cloth than on wine. Twice as much. They'll spend 2/3 of their income on cloth. I'm going to put wine. The starting productivities in the two countries are England is good at cloth, poor at wine. Portugal the other way around. Poor at cloth, good at wine. And then we're going to trace what happens as Portugal improves. We're going to trace what happens. I should be wearing a throat mic, I guess, as Portugal improves. Now, those numbers I want to explain because it is important to realize that there is an effect here, a very important effect in all these outcomes, which is you can't do better than the best technology. Right? In other words, you can't make a car with 1/8 of a person in 5 minutes. Right? There's a limit to what you can produce at any given moment in any given country. We take that value as the value of 1. When we say productivity of 1, therefore we're at the best technology. If we say a value is 0.4, we're slightly below half of that. Okay. And so we will only consider, when we consider various possible inputs for productivities, they're all less than 1. And eventually we're going to look at them all. So you have to understand that that limit expresses that technology does not expand infinitely at any given moment. Okay. All right. So we're ready now to take us through this drama, starting with England, and at that starting position, when England has good productivity, the best possible in cloth, and Portugal the best possible in wine, it turns out that England does all the cloth making and Portugal does all the wine making. Did I say that in the right order? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Now, we're going to watch that change. This is what happens as things change. All right. Portugal starts out here pretty low, as we'll see in a minute. Low utility, low income, not much cloth, not much cloth. But once it starts making cloth itself better, even though it is not making it as well as England, it gets up to 0.7, England's at 1 productivity. That still has a positive impact on its cloth consumption. Its wine consumption, still making that at home, does not move. Now, in this third stage, it moves from 0.7 to 1. It gets the best possible technology, matches that of England. Its utility goes up, its income goes up, its cloth consumption goes up because it's making it very well at home now. But its wine consumption, which it's always been good at, is stable. All right? So we see a clear-cut advancement in Portugal by having gotten into the cloth business. Don't forget, the cloth business is the big one. That's the one that people are willing to pay a lot of money for. Okay? Let's take one more chart. Here's England. At the beginning, good stuff for England. But it's all down here. When Portugal goes to 0.7, England holds on to, it's still making cloth, but its wine consumption goes down. Why? Because it's now not making all the world's cloth. It's only making some of it. Portugal making some of it too. There's less income. The exchange rate changes. With its money, it buys less wine. Wages are up in Portugal. That means less wine for England since they started. And that keeps going. Look at the difference between what England gets after Portugal has developed the cloth industry. It's all downhill for England. Now that's worth mentioning because there are so many people who believe that the development of your trading partner is automatically good for you. Now that just plain isn't true. And I'll give you one example. I could give you 10 examples. I could give you 10,000 examples. But you should not leap to the conclusion that the development of your trading partner is always bad for you. In fact, what we will see when we start to understand the pattern of this sort of thing is that the impact of an improving trading partner is good for your country, even though you may lose markets or part of markets. But if it's a very undeveloped trading partner, but as it develops, it turns around, and it turns bad, and it stays bad. Early stage is good, later stage is bad. Okay? Thanks. Okay. Now, in order to look at all sorts of possibilities, not just like one example, we're going to have to change the way we present the results. Bar graphs are too clumsy. And we're going to have to introduce the utility income diagram. That will enable, it's going to pay for itself. So please make an effort to look hard at it. Right? It's worth it. Okay. Right. So let me go back one. You'll notice that in these graphs, these bar graphs, there were two very concrete things. They got so much cloth, they got that much wine. But there were also two summary statistics saying how good this was. There was its income, actually, its share of world income. You take the total income, divide it, so this would be like 2/3. This would be 2/3. Yeah, this 2/3. Right. And the utility, the way of measuring how good the bundle of goods is. Right? And what we're going to do, because we're going to end up having an awful lot of cloth, wine, piglets, and everything else, all right, is we're just going to use a summary that says how good was it. All right. Now what that does for you is it enables you to plot a point, because you can characterize the country's outcome by its utility and its income. Two summary statistics. And we'll start plotting those points. And then we'll be able to see what the real story is. Okay? This is how we will plot one economic outcome. The black dot. Right? The height of it tells you how much utility country 1 gets, that outcome. And the gray dot tells you how much utility country 2 gets. It takes a pair of points because there really are two different outcomes. So we're going to then see several of these. Right? Here are our 3 points that we had before. We had 3 outcomes. This was the first. Then Portugal started to improve its cloth productivity. That had a negative impact on England, but a positive impact on Portugal. This is really a gray and a black dot. It just depends which gets printed first. All right? So they're both there at the end. So now we can see that whole progression just in these 3 pairs of points. So nothing will prevent us from computing lots and lots and lots more points. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So we're going to do that. Okay. And that will lead us to the next. Okay, folks. We've now computed a lot of points. Each of these is a pair. Right? I think which ones go with which. Well, it's a little hard to tell which ones go with. It's easy to see that this must go with this must go with this, and so forth. So these are all point pairs, giving pairs of outcomes. Now, it's not obvious that this tells you much of a story, right? But in fact, since I happen to know the answer to the story, it does. Okay? If you look at the black dots, they seem to sort of have a shape. And if you look at the gray dots, the outcomes for the other country, they too sort of seem to have a shape. Okay? And I can just tell you that if you put out more and more and more and more points, that shape would get clearer and clearer and clearer and clearer. Right? And pretty soon, we would be seeing the outcome for almost anything that you can imagine. And this is what it would look like. Right. Those are the dots I was just showing you. But this is a boundary line. Okay. If you put in more and more and more black dots and their accompanying gray dots, all the black dots will lie under this blue line. So its shape matters. Right? The things that are close to or onto it are the most productive, the best outcomes for country 1. Similarly for country 2. If we kept putting out more and more dots, this would fill in solidly. But the ones that matter are the ones up here. And it's nice, we can actually calculate those curves very rapidly. So we have here, so to speak, the picture of all possible equilibria. If we put up all the equilibria between 0 and 1. The shape turns out this to be the shape. Our old friend that we started with, England makes all the cloth, turns out to be quite an exceptional point from England's point of view. It's the best. Nowhere else under this blue thing does England get that kind of reward. But it's also true that there is a corresponding one over here for Portugal. If it could just learn, it requires 2 things. Don't forget, when England had a 1 in its productivity for the big thing, cloth, Portugal had a low number. 2 things are required for Portugal. That it should have a 1 in cloth, and that England should have that low number. In other words, we saw Portugal marching up, right, along from starting here and marching up to there. That's what we saw. Can it go on? No. Not on its own. To get to this highly desirable point, it requires for England's productivity to go down, and there's no other way. So I'm saying that not by chance, but as by part of this situation, the destruction of your trading partners' industries are necessary for you to reach what is for you the best possible outcome. I think there's one more special point that is related to this picture. I've talked about this one and this one. These are the best possible points for the 2 different countries. They're bad for each other. This is the dominant, this is the subservient. This is the dominant, this is the subservient. But there's that fellow in the middle. Now, why might it be plausible that that outcome is a good one? Right? Say compared to this and this. Well, it isn't. It's not as good from country 1's point of view. It's not as good from country 2's point of view. On the other hand, we know that in going, say, from here to here, industries had to be destroyed. They had to have their productivities lowered. Here in the middle, that's not true. They can both be fully developed. So it might be that the total output of the world By the world, we mean the two countries. Is better here, even though it's not as good for England. Portugal is good for Portugal. Let's see. Aha. And now that line shows you the boundary for world equilibrium. If we just added up the points here, both points, and got a value for the output for the world, we would find that that output peaks here. And that's a third significant point. There are three significant points really in these diagrams. This one, and this one. Now, this one is in this case, this point is not much higher than this point, which is what the world would get if England made all the cloth and Portugal made all the wine, and vice versa. Not much difference. The real difference, as you move along this curve, is who gets it. The total doesn't change that much. That is a phenomenon that is special to this two-industry case. And we will see it disappear as soon as we get out of two industries and get into 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 100. And we will see that this point, the third significant point, goes up. So there's a great deal to be lost by having one or the other be dominant. These are the three important points. Dominant England, dominant Portugal, best for the world. In that two-industry model. Let's move on. Here's a sixth good one. You'll notice now that, in fact, this is much higher. The world has lost a great deal if we have a dominant England or a dominant Portugal. It's much better to have it fully developed and adding up to something better for the world. Okay? So this picture tells you an awful lot of things. Okay? That on its way from nothingness to dominance, several things happen. First, in the early stages of its development, it's very, very low here. Right? Say from between here and here, what is its effect on the other country? It's mostly an up effect. Here it doesn't have much effect. There's a jump, a big jump up here. By the time it's here, it's there. So it has moved the other country from there to there. Right? Now that, I mean, that is the stage where there are substantial benefits to this very rich country. It's very high up. To have this country go from almost nothing to something. It moved up. But after that, folks, it's all downhill. As Portugal develops, I guess this is England in this side, but as this country develops, you see this one going down. Now we're going to see that in all the diagrams you could ever possibly compute. I'll just show you a few. But there's a theorem which says they got to have the shape. And therefore, it's true. When you start improving, it's good for your partner, and you improve more than a little bit. It turns around, it goes bad. There's 6. There's 11. Right, now you can see that in spite of sort of the jaggedness of the actual boundaries, which you can have, I used random numbers for the productivities and everything in this model. Okay, so you get all sorts of funny little things. With the shape, you cannot escape it. There's a limiting shape. And all you do, as you add more and more goods, is get closer and closer to that shape. And it's that shape, with its early helpfulness, right? And then its later negative impact on the fact that a dominant position like this, or like this, does not compare from a world standpoint with a middle position. Those are the morals of the chart. Okay? And also, from a defensive standpoint, you want to look at it this way. If you are fully developed, you can prevent your improving partner from ever getting past the middle. You can, so to speak, hold the middle. And therefore, there is, not only from a country point of view, a reward for having the ability to sustain your industries. You do not become subservient. But from a world point of view, that you prevent your trading partner from going past, bringing down the world. Okay? So I think that I've shown you the things that I meant to show you. Oh, except how persistent this shape is. Even if you double the size, it looks less of one of the countries. Size matters a lot in these calculations. You still have the same basic shape. One peak here, one peak there. So let me summarize. In a world in which countries can learn and can change their productivities, that's not the world that Ricardo lived in. You couldn't suddenly switch from wine to cloth. But in our world, you can go from nothing to making silicon pretty easily. We've shown this, that the economic development of your trading partner can be harmful. We've seen that by an example. And we've also seen that the structural picture is that it starts good, and then it turns bad. That there is a dominant and subservient relation possible between two countries. And one that is good for the dominant and bad for the subservient one. That it needs, that a dominant country, it can only be dominant if it has a weak, underdeveloped, or partially destroyed trading partner. Can't be if it's held on to its industries. And that there's an inherent conflict, not only between a nation in a dominant position with its trading partner, but also between that player, that dominant player, and the world. The fifth point, and I may have said this already, while a country cannot gain a dominant position by building up its own industries, it can avoid a subservient position by developing its own industries and holding on to them and not letting them be destroyed. It is quite possible, switching from the model to the real world, that the United States and China were in the dominant and undeveloped stage some time ago. But China can hardly be thought to be in that state now. And therefore, we should be thinking at least that we should not allow our industries to be destroyed so that we become a subservient nation. Thank you all very much, and I appreciate your coming here.
Should we put it back on the speaker? Oh, okay, here we go. So we'll get questions now. If you would just like to call anyone in the audience, and you can use continue to use that.
Okay.
Please identify yourselves.
Thank you very much. I'm David Rosenberg from Middlebury College. How do you know where the turning point is?
That's a very good question. Okay. I think there are a number of ways that you can do this. Right? One is to look at the exchange rate and so forth. But the point I would mainly like to make is that the policy of holding on to the industries is a very stable one. The turning point is here. If your trading partner is improving at this point, it's good for you, and later it's bad for you. So in a certain sense, it's at this point you want to start holding on and not losing anymore. Right? So you only really have to, as far as policy is concerned, you really only have to know, oh, they've gotten out of that low state. Okay. And I think that would be quite easy to approximate. Well, I mean, I think you could look at how productive they are on the average. Value add per person. That kind of stuff.
Mark Gruenberg of Press Associates. Talk about the factors other than currency, which you mentioned already, that go into making one particular country that had been subservient, not subservient, particularly the U.S.-China relationship. I'm thinking of the labor factor in particular.
Well, of course, there is a labor factor, but what we actually see is that many industries that have very, very low labor content, take making chips, my former hobby, right? Right. Now, how does that come about? Right. The government of China and of several other Asian countries has a very different approach. I think they call it government-guided free market. And so if they think it's important to have a very productive industry like chips, not only because it's economic impact, but because there's spillovers from that to other areas, they will simply make it almost impossible for a U.S. company not to go to China and build stuff there. There are many ways. One is they won't give them market access if they do it. Another is that they will subsidize the building. When you build a plant, a chip factory, a fab, right? Most of the cost is in the building. Now, in the Intel case, I think they split that with the government of China. I think they got about $2 billion from the government to build that. That made it incomparably cheap. Made the labor thing look very small. So if you have a government that has decided to develop, it has all sorts of abilities like that. Now, it's especially true if you have a developing country, because basically, as you bring in industries and your standard of living, the earning power of your people goes up because it's being hooked onto machines instead of wooden poles or something like that. You don't have to let them have the full value that's being created. You can keep that part at the disposal of the government. The government of China today has at its disposal about $2.7 trillion. And you can use that money to make it profitable for American corporations to build in China. And there are still other things. I mean, if you have a sovereign country with a lot of money and the desire to get industries, they can do it because they can make it profitable. And in this country and in England and a few other countries, we have a totally free market. We just let people do that. And in many countries, they have their own desires about what industries to keep, and they try and counter these moves. Yes.
Yeah. My name is Dan Lieberman. Right here. You see, the early economists, Adam Smith right here, Ricardo and Marx seem to indicate that capitalism needed free trade to survive. You were saying that with free trade, capitalism will not survive. Do you feel that there's a contradiction there? And the second thing is your idea any related to Marx's idea of the falling rate of profit?
Of the what?
Marx's concept of the falling rate of profit.
I'm not really good at that, Marx, I guess, for it. But anyway, I think you have to distinguish profit and value added in a country. If you build a plant and it's very productive, and so that per person employed, there's a tremendous output sold at a good price. That adds to your GDP. Now, profit is something else. I mean, if it was a very competitive industry, the profit might be almost zero. So being driven by profit is one way to go. But paying attention to the impact on your country's GDP is another thing to look at. And that's what's being looked at in these market-directed government-directed things. Yes.
Hi, Rob. Thanks very much. Rob Scott from EPI. I want to push you on another dimension of the model. I don't know if you've had time to think about it or not.
Yep.
That is, again, going back to the labor dimension.
Yes.
And I think in one of the next chapters in Krugman and Osfeld's refined discussion of the Hector-Samuelson theorem that talks about the distribution of wages.
Yes.
And have you thought about what this model means for the distribution of wages, particularly for production workers, as we move from the optimum point for, say, the U.S. to the global maximum?
To the global maximum.
Right. What happens to workers' wages?
I think they go down because at this point, both the utility and the income. If you move from here to here, utility and income both go down. It's not under your control in the sense that it's not that you have slipped. You're still as productive as ever. Your workers are. But it's the impact, which I showed in one example, of someone else getting into the game. Right? So I think it would be a negative impact. At this point, though, the game changes. You can only have further losses if you lose productivity. Yes, please.
Michael Bradfield. The way you explain the model is that at a certain point, at the beginning, it's positive for both parties and then turns negative for the dominant party. And what's unclear to me is this inherent in the model, or is it inherent in the way that the model is implemented in the real world? Because some of the explanations you've given here relate to what we call distortions in China's trade policy. So is it the policy, or is it inherent in the model? And if it is inherent in the model, why?
Okay. First of all, this is produced in a model in which trade is balanced and there are no distortions of any sort. Right? In other words, in the model, it is necessary to lower the numerical productivity for these things to happen. Right? Now, it's a separate step to say, how would that come about? I'm just saying, look, over here, excuse me, I guess you're talking about this part here. If the productivity of the country increases, balanced trade, a perfect trade model, free exchange and everything else, it will have a negative impact. Yes. In the model. Now, how did they manage to lift themselves up by that bootstrap? That's a separate question. But if the government can do something to increase the productivity in those countries, then you'll see that.
Rosh Ibrahim with the Hoskin Center for International Studies. I'm curious on your stance on protectionism, primarily, and how that affects this model with things such as tariffs and ad valorem tax. Tariffs and ad valorem tax, where it's a tax on the raw material that you're trading, and then it goes to manufacturing. How that interacts with this model, and also the setting of world prices when it comes to the world benefit.
I don't think I'm familiar with the thing you're talking about in the first half of the question, so I'm not going to try and improvise an answer. I don't know. But in the second one, could you repeat the second question?
The second part is just talking about, it's basically about protectionism in order to counteract what you're saying, the demise of the two countries.
I don't think I specified how you're going to hold on to industries. Right? Okay. But, and there are many ways to do that. You can match subsidies, whatever you want to do. There's Warren Buffett. Yeah. I think, this is a personal opinion, has nothing to do with the model. The model speaks for itself. Right? In addition, I have opinions about how that maps onto the real world. And now I'm going to go into that part. Okay. I think there are two words that are anathema to many English and American economists. And those two words are protectionism and mercantilism. My own view is they go together. If you don't have mercantilism, you don't need protectionism. If you do have mercantilism, you need protectionism. So I think I would be, if convinced that in the real world we are opposed by mercantilism, which I am convinced, I would say, yeah, we need protectionism.
It's more of a Japanese model.
Japanese model, I think, is basically a fairly mild form. Singapore, on a small scale, has a beautiful model like this. Korea, to some extent. China's the best and biggest. Yeah. Yes. Mark.
Mark Brodsky, retired physicist. In this model, as you go from 2 goods to 6 goods to 11 goods, I'm assuming that you have the same kind of trend in the mole. One country starts at top and the other country starts getting better.
Yeah.
But if you have a multi-good model where some goods are going, where you're getting one country's getting better in some and worse in others, how does that feed back into the? I mean, that's the free market people, the free trade people would argue. Well, as you lose in one, you gain in another.
Yeah, but I think that's right. Right. What you lose in one, you might gain in another. But the net, as counted up by national income or utility, goes down. It goes down. It doesn't matter if there are 20 of these things. You might lose 3, gain 4. It also depends how big the ones you gain are. Right? But there's no way for it to be a gain. Right? That's built in. If you want to have equilibria that have these incomes and these utilities, and that's what there are, you know that the losses will outweigh the gains. There will be, just as you described, a lot of pushing and pulling. But every push helps you, and every pull, which way it's pushing and pulling, I'm not sure. But when you lose them, it hurts at this point. When you gain them, it helps. Yeah. Yeah.
Hugh McElrath, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So following on to your just previous discussion, does that mean it's just as good to have a T-shirt factory turning out T-shirts at $6 a piece as it is to have a chip fab or an automobile plant?
Well, first of all, it's good to have a big value-add industry. That adds more to GDP. If you said, what would it be better to have a great big T-shirt factory or to have boutique special manufacturing one? I probably would say, let's see. It really depends on a per capita basis. The kind of industry you want to have, is high output per capita involved, per person involved. Now, and I don't mean high profit per person. I mean, what does that T-shirt sell for compared to what the manufacturing output sells for, and how many people did it take to make them? So I think that the way to look at goodness and badness in industries is per capita productivity, high value add per person involved. Add up high value adds per person involved, you get a high GDP. So I think that would be a purely economic scorecard. Right? Now, we all know that there are other factors which are not in this model or in any model, spillovers of all sorts. It's also true that chip making progresses more rapidly than T-shirt making. At least I think it does. And so it has more of a future than T-shirt making. And we might also be more competitive in chips than T-shirts. Although we're not because of the subsidies. So I think it's more that question.
Jim Case, not quite retired mathematician.
does your version of Ricardo's model take into account transportation costs and idle resources?
It doesn't do either. It's the absolute basic. I'm sorry, it does not do either. It's an absolute vanilla model.
Those alone invalidate Ricardo's conclusions.
Well, I don't really agree. You see, it's a very interesting question that you're touching on here, okay? Which is, there are other forces involved than those described. But in my experience, that's normal. That's normal. Let me give you my Galileo story. Since you're sitting next to a physicist, I feel that that's legitimate. Right? One day, Galileo climbed up to the Leaning Tower, and he dropped off, I believe, a cannonball. And then he dropped a wooden ball, which was much lighter. And by cracky, they both hit the ground to within the limits of his experimental error at the same time. Right? And so let's say he formulates this law. It's the law of 32 feet per second, right? And anything will fall at 32 feet per second, whether it's made of wood or not, mechanical. Right? So he was running around, but he ran into severe opposition. First of all, a little boy went up and threw off a feather. Didn't work. So someone looked up in the sky. They saw a bird. Hey, how come this bird is not falling at 32 feet per second? The answer is that there's another force involved. Okay? And that is the force of air. And it's very small for a heavy object moving slowly. And it's very strong if the object is moving rapidly through the air. That's why an airplane works. It should be falling at 32 feet per second. Okay? And by the way, this is more than saying there are imperfections, which is a very pet phrase of mine. This is more than an imperfection in the law of gravity. It's a whole other force. Does that mean that we should not consider gravity? No. It means that some situations it can be overwhelmed, or at least equaled, by other things. And so it does not throw out a theory to say that there are other forces, and it is one of them. I think that is the correct way to look at almost any theory that you have. Right? It's very hard to find a theory that really matches the real world. You can say it matches in some circumstances, or it's one of the forces acting. Now we've got to consider transportation, or we've got to consider the impact of air. And I would say what's shown here is like that. It's a set you have to consider.
Galileo did mention air resistance, by the way.
Who did?
Galileo.
I presume he was not an economist. Yeah.
Pat Malloy, I'm with the China Commission. Here's one. I was reading this Wall Street Journal editorial today, and here's what it says. In part, I'm going to quote it. Quote, nearly 4 decades of engagement with Beijing have yielded important benefits for both sides, including the rise of hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty and the mutual benefits of a robust trading partnership. The U.S. would be less affluent today without Chinese goods and markets. Do you think that's the correct assumption in looking at this economic relationship with China? Is it mutually beneficial, or according to your chart, at what point would it begin to change?
Well, first of all, according to we have to always distinguish between the model and reality. Right? The model is a tool. It's a way to see how things interact, and then you look at the real world and say, are they acting that way? Now, my guess is that there's little doubt that at this point, further improvements in China are bad for the U.S., according to this model. How long ago that happened, and what the net, first of all, did it happen? I think it did. But I can't add up the net dollars. Right? My own guess is that in recent years it's turned negative. And by the way, I think we're going to be seeing more of that stuff in the future. I think the impact on people's jobs, on lower wages, and so forth. I'd say it's probably net negative. You can say, well, we got to create cheap goods, and it's a trade-off. You get cheap goods, but you're out of a job, so you can't buy them. You have, and someone has to quantify that. And I can't claim that I've done a study like this. My instinctive response is I think it's turned negative recently.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Ralph Collins.
Thank you all for being here.